See this rose? I've got to make one of these for a daughter-in-law. It's overdue. I've got to make it happen. The only reason I can do this is because I met Cy Swan 2 months after I got my blacksmith gear, which happened 19 years ago. He's had a huge impact in my life. He made this for my mom. Let's see if I can make one of these, at least almost this nice, for Cambria. One of the really terrific things about blacksmithing is you generally don't need too much in the way of materials. Materials is the smallest part of the cost associated with the things you make. Now you need some tools, and you need some time, and you need some patience. But for this rose, all I need is really like 32 inches of half-inch round stock, hot rolled half-inch round, and just a little bit of 21 gauge sheet metal. 21 gauge is thin enough that it looks like a rose petal, and it's thin enough that you can cut it with tin snips, and it's thick enough to hold its shape and give the rose some muscle. I count on the fact that nature is beautiful because of its irregularity, right? I mean, the design, the function, the aesthetic of nature is unsurpassable. But as far as precision and duplication, nature counts on approximate as part of the beauty. That gives me some slack when I make the rose itself. So I need to make 6 little roughly circular pieces out of this sheet metal. I need to make one that is somewhere around 5 inches round, and it doesn't have to be perfect. You can just give yourself a couple of references so you're close, and then you draw the circle like this. Close enough. I'm going to make one about 4.5 inches, and I start to go through the material pretty fast. So we're going to come in here like this. There's about 4.5. And then I need one somewhere around 4. I'm going to skip over here like this. One, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, reducing in size. A plasma cutter is a luxury, but you can cut these out with a pair of tin snips if you want. So I don't know much about my plasma cutter except that it's a miracle. I know that it's best for sheet metal. It just works so well on everything. And one of the miracles, besides how fast it is how little heat actually accumulates in your work. Now I cut this thing maybe 60 seconds ago. And between the thinness of the material and how localized the heat is, you can just pick them up and go to work. So by the way, it almost doesn't matter what kind of a shop you've got or what kind of work you do. I have discovered, and I wish I would have discovered years before, that a 2x72 is almost the most useful tool you can own. For any craft, for any kind of effort, a 2x72 is a game changer. And I'm really happy with the Fear grinder that I got, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago. It's a good one. So the location of this hole can be approximate. I mean, roses are weird, but the size of the hole is critical. I drill it 3/16 of an inch. So this pile of sheet metal now needs to be cut into shapes that can be textured and turned into that. The first one, and the smallest diameter piece, becomes this little jacket that, if you look at a rose, has encompassed the bud and then turns back. It's a different color, it's green, and it becomes just sort of a throwaway. But everything around about a rose petal is in 5s. So we begin to think in terms of a 5-pointed star that we create, and then on the petals we just make cuts in that pentagon orientation. So at least trying to draw it, you can see where you're wrong before you actually start cutting. And you bring this up to, within maybe a quarter or so of the edge of the hole. And it doesn't matter if it comes to a tight point out on the ends. Okay, I've cut up the star. Actually, I've got 3 here, and I'm going to pick the one that is the least bad. You know, you might take more time, but you don't have to, because if you look underneath the real rows, they're somewhat irregular and they are secondary to the effect. Okay, so the next move is a little easier. Let me throw that away. Keep those 2. You just draw, if you need to draw, and apparently I do need to draw, the 5-point line, and now instead of leaving the points, you're just cutting the lines up to the same close proximity. Because you're going to want that around the circle to fold up down inside of that rose and not give you too much resistance when you're assembling this thing. And then you just clip off these corners to begin to approximate the oval shape. Rinse and repeat. This is a butcher. It's essentially an all-steel chisel with a rather abrupt bevel entirely from one side to the other. It makes a cut with one side square to the piece you're working with. It's often the first step in isolating part of the mass of a workpiece as you're drawing out a tenon or creating a sharp, clean step. So you can see that a guillotine tool makes accuracy easy, but you still need to draw out square and section and then go to round or octagonal. So the point of butchering is to give yourself the beginning of a flat shoulder. Now we're going to clean that up, and we're going to switch over to the power hammer in just a few minutes. But I just want to show you the way that you do this if you have to do it by hand. I want this to end up 1/4 of an inch in diameter, and so I don't want to overdo it. Square to octagonal to round-ish. So I need to make this long and skinny, about 1/4 of an inch in diameter. I'm going to start that at the anvil and just sort of draw it out by hand so you can get a look at that. And then I'm going to take advantage of the advantage I have and use a power hammer just to cut about, 20 minutes of hard work out of this. Necking this down to somewhere near that 1/4 inch. You can do this with a cross peen or with a striker. Okay, here is how you get a flat shoulder at the back of your tenon on this thing. It's all drawn down to where it just will not drive down into that vise. I put some pads on there. You take a monkey tool, which has got a 1/4 inch hole in it. You slide over the tenon, which I already ground on this one to receive 1/4 inch, and then you just tap that down. And it's creating a flat shoulder at the end of that tenon to fit into the rose petal, which acts as a mortise. So that's how I do that when I haven't already wrecked this. Now let me show you, I sort of exaggerate these opposing fullers just to make people think of thorns and to add interest. I may have overdone it a little bit. It's easy to make texture look more like caricature than texture. It's a fine line. I often err on the side of caricature, but I'm getting better. So if we were using this one, the way I start that is I get out on the tip of the horn and I hit it directly across with a rounding hammer. Like that, sort of. So what I'm going to work on now is making 3 leaves. Okay, they need to be kind of abrupt, maybe a little smaller than that. And Cy has almost a patented process. That's a joke, but he does a great job of creating these veins on the back. I don't think I'm ever going to get them quite as fine and well rendered as Cy's, but that's what we're shooting for on rose leaves. So I'm going to stop right there, and I'm going to actually chill this and then do the same thing to the other end. So on that other one, I got some of the tip out over the edge of the anvil. Not helpful. You only have to work from 2 sides on this because it's all going to flatten out. So it doesn't need to be conical. It just needs to be an abrupt taper, kind of like that. And then I'm going to try to do a little better job of making the neck. So I'm using the edge of the anvil and trying to stay consistent and where I hit with that cross peen. Easier said than done to create a neck without breaking it off. I'm going to stop with that and then draw this down a little, being careful not to fold that back and forth too many times. This was our first one. I got to shrink that a little bit. Lighter hammer, pulling it back, octagonal. Lighter hammer. Small enough on the square. Octagonal. Don't fatigue it. We're going octagon there. We're not pushing our luck for that first 2 inches. We'll draw out the stem a little more in a minute. I think I have these 3 leaves roughed in with the stems roughed in about the same. I'm going to cut this long piece in half so I can have all 3 pieces in my hand to look at them as they now flatten and texture and fold, so I can kind of keep track of how they are side by side. Because it's important, because rose leaves typically are more similar than different. So this is one place to try to get them the same. But the tip of that, I came close to burning it, and so there's some nastiness there I'm going to grind off. I just, an ounce of prevention and all that, right? So I think it's kind of important that I find the profile that is the most symmetric when I flatten this out, so that the lobes on the, there. so that the lobes on the leaf are more or less even within the allowable tolerance that nature would use. So you notice I build a little fire dam here to keep the flame from blowing back up the bar and getting the bar hot. That's so I can hold it by hand. And I mean, that's one of the advantages of a coal forge. You can work right here. And if I'm getting in over your head, I mean, if this is too much trivia, or if you want more minutia, in the Essential Blacksmith Academy, that's our subscription group, our online community. We've got a blacksmithing course that dives deep into all of that, like what's a fire dam and what's it used for, as an example. Check it out. Coal forge, short heat. Gotta love it. Look for the symmetric face and just flatten it. We're going to encourage it to get wider. Now some guys will just use a cross peen texture on a leaf and it looks nice, but that's not how Cy does it, and we're making a Cy Swan Rose. So a couple of things. You may not have noticed, but I'm regulating the blast with a little air damper right here. And I don't want this too hot because as that metal gets thin, it burns up so easy. So it's just whispering along. Boom, that's hot. And if I didn't mention it already, I want to make sure that I have about the same amount of mass on both sides of the center line. And since it's kind of erratic, I judge that at the moment I begin to flatten it, like that. And you can control it with the cross peen by kind of rolling that thing back and forth and exaggerating the stretch with the cross peen. Now this time I'm going to concentrate on thinning the edges with the rounding hammer. It's probably thin enough. Rose leaves are kind of heart-shaped. Okay, so here's what we're doing now. I'm going to put a center line with a cold chisel or a hot cut right down the middle, from the center of the stem to as close to the tip as I can. Cy is so good at this. And I'm not going to put as many serrations in there, I don't think, but center line and then fold them. And it's another chance to ruin everything. So these first blows are the ones that commit you to success or failure. Like that, reasonably successful. Yep, that works. Mark we can live with. I don't like to take the cut clear to the tip because it wants to tear out there anyway. But I think that's going to be a win. Center of the world if you can. Run it back up the stem a little ways as it gets cold. Yes, right out there. The guy that flattened that put a nice little ridge down the middle for me to follow. Not perfect, but pretty good. A walking chisel is just that. You can make incremental changes because it's curved. That's pretty good. There, that's good. That's what we want on that. A little more in the back. Up into the stem. Yeah. So this fire pot, it's a Centaur Forge fire pot. It's about 6 inches deep. And the further towards the middle you get, the hotter it is. Right at the bottom, not that hot. But down there low, it's seriously hot. And so I'm just letting these things rest up here in the top with almost no draft blowing. And hopefully they'll stay hot so I can do this little tedious texturing without burning them up. Here's the face side. Deep, but not too deep. Close counts. There we go. Concentrate on the back where it's stiff. Try to make sure it's centering up out there. Pretty good. And then concentrate on the back of it. On both sides a little bit. And the more you can set that down, the finer the spine of it is on the back of the leaf. That's about as thin as I want to get it. So now we go to the vise and we sneak that back open. All right, that'll fit over the edge of the anvil. Yeah, sharper chisel. This is a little bit of silliness here because I could just put a MIG weld on the ends of these before I forge weld them together. But I want to put a little rivet in here just to see if we can. So I've made a very rough little 3/16 rivet that I'm just going to cold peen over to hold these together. And then I'm going to forge weld these things, and the rivet's going to keep it in there. Now, if I was really adept, I would do a drop tong forge weld here, but I am not that. Cold rivet that's going to get a lot better in just a minute. It's not tight yet, it's not ready to weld, but we're going to get a little flux in there before we tighten up the scarf. We've got a little bit of coal dust in there, that's no good. Let's see how this does. Initial flux. I'm going to get it hot enough to close up the scarf. So now the rivet and the steel is all in complete contact. We're going to flux it again. A mistake that's easy to make is you think that, okay, it's hot, I got to get to the anvil while it's hot, and you do, and I've got to hit it. You don't hit it, you nudge it. You just nudge them into contact, because if you hit it, you stretch the metal and it breaks the weld apart that you're making. So you just nudge it together until you get the initial weld. We'll see if we can do that. A little bit of spark. Hold it up off the anvil so the anvil doesn't suck the heat out of it. Maybe. Flux it again. I would like to crowd the weld on up the pieces if I can. The neutral part of the fire is the middle. The bottom has more oxygen than it needs. The top has less oxygen than it needs. And so ideally, you're somewhere in about the middle of the fire pot. There are people who do not need flux because they start with clean steel and keep it in a neutral flame, and the scale never develops, and they can weld without flux. And I am not that guy. I'm going to assume that that's stuck, and I'm going to hit it harder and start drawing out all that extra material out of the scarf. Wow, this is rubbery. If I was going to guess, I would guess we've got a pretty good weld down there, and I would like to crowd that up so they're welded up where their diameter is smaller, because I've got these stems a little bit long and stringy, so I'd like to tighten them up if I can. I'm going to treat that as a scarf, flux that, and try to get it welded up another 3/4 of an inch if I can, without reducing it all to where it's too small. Getting hot, the sparks are going to start right now. I'm going to wire brush this while it's hot to try to get rid of some of that flux before it gets too hard. Messy. So I'm not terribly delighted with these leaves, but they'll be pretty good. But what I've got to do now is weld this little collection of leaves onto this stem, get a forge weld, and then draw that out to where the diameter gets down to where it all looks the same. But instead of doing a drop tong weld or riveting that like I did on this, I'm going to cheat. I'm going to get the MIG gun out because this is day 2. I just got to where I needed to take a little break and come back to this with fresh eyes. So I'm going to start with a 21st century cheat and put a MIG gun tack right there to hold it so I get a good clean weld without a great deal of trouble. So that little tack's going to go away. All it's doing is holding this in position until I can tighten that scarf up, get 100% contact, flux it, and hopefully get a nice tight forge weld that I can draw out into a seamless transition. I'm doing this just to keep the heat and the flux from getting clear up into those leaves and burning anything there. I hope it works. John Adolph can do it, but John Adolph can do anything. So we're going to try. I'm going to hold up with that and tighten up the, actually I'm going to flux that right there. Going to flux it again, get it nice and hot. One more heat. All right, we're going to wire brush that a little bit and then start assembling a rose. See, that flux makes what's essentially glass that I've got to clean off there. I'm going to the slack tub. Okay, so our next move is to heat these up and thin the edges and texture them and blacken them and begin to cup them down so we can push them down onto the stem and assemble the blossom. This will be the first piece that goes on, and then from the biggest proceeding down to the smallest. Now we're going to texture all these actual petals. Same way. I'm going to squeeze these two outside ones down a little bit. It's easier now. But the idea is if you make a rose that's really enclosed, it's a younger, fresher rose, and if you let it, it's more mature, right? I mean the rose opens up and becomes larger and more beautiful, but sometimes more condensed is what you want. Yeah, I think that's pretty good. We're going to close that largest one up a little bit. I think we can work with that. Let's see if this will go together. If I didn't already mention it, and perhaps even if I did, this is called a monkey tool. Ken Jordan made those for me. If you've got a lathe, you can do that. And the idea is that hole slips over that tenon, and then we'll set the inside of that flower right down against the shoulder of the stem. So if you saw me cutting that slot, it's so this will compress just a little bit, because if you remember, we drilled these at 3/16, and this tenon is pretty much 1/4 inch, so it's a friction fit, and then we'll get down in there and split that tenon and fold it over and rivet it down to hold everything in, we hope. Yeah. That 3/16 hole locks onto that 1/4 inch tenon pretty nice. Let's see how this is going to work. Yep. Right down on the shoulder. I hope we've got enough to get 3 more on there. And if you can, as if you don't have enough to worry about, you try to cover the seam of the previous petal with the middle of this petal. I didn't get that done on there. Yes, started. We've been shearing a little bit of the sheet metal up on the side of the tenon, but it's too late to turn back now. So we're going to collapse this rose petal a little bit. So this is a good reason on the interior petals to make the cuts a little closer into the hole. I'm going to try to grind off that corner without creating something ugly, and maybe it'll go down in there. The whole success of the project comes down to this moment. So we're centered up pretty well. Hopefully, this is going to slide around there, leaving enough material projecting to pinch it in. Okay, I could have left 7/16 sticking up instead of 3/8, but now I'm going to take a cold chisel and spread that. So now I've got to give it some life, and that's done by sort of working and squeezing and putting the irregular bends and the lifelike configuration. I can squeeze them all in now one at a time. I think that rivet is very strong. And so as long as I don't get it hot down there in the bottom and weaken the 21 gauge metal, I can just get the tops hot and bring them over, close it up so it looks something like that.
Well, as it turns out, this rose is not quite as nice as the one that Cy made for my mom 15 years ago. And I can accept that because Cy is so good at forging the objects that are found in nature in iron. There are some aspects of the craft of blacksmithing that I can do as well as he can, but not nature and not knives. I've been able to introduce a few folks to the fantastic world of blacksmithing, and it just tickles me every time to see others learn and develop in that craft and experience the joy, the blessing of adding a little beauty to the lives of others. Thanks for watching Essential Craftsman, and keep up the good work.